Hello and welcome to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. The law of unintended consequences. Europe has finally started to address a humanitarian crisis partially of its own making, the growing wave of refugees from war-torn Middle East. As EU members grapple with binding quotas and the cost of refugee settlement, is anyone in Brussels, or NATO for that matter, considering ending wars of choice? To CrossTalk, the refugee crisis in Europe, I'm joined by my guest, Ramzy Baroud in Seattle. He is an author, journalist, and political analyst. In London, we have Saba Al-Mukhtar. He is a lawyer and an independent political analyst. And in Paris, we cross to John Laughlin. He's director of studies at the Institute for Democracy and Cooperation. All right, gentlemen, CrossTalk rules. In fact, that means you can jump in anytime you want, and I very much appreciate it. Ramzy, if I go to you first in Seattle, you got up very early this morning to be on this program, and we all very much appreciate it. One of the things that strikes me in looking at all of the stories being written over the last 10 days or so about this refugee crisis in Europe is that everyone's talking about the cost of it, how unprepared local officials are, and all about the numbers, you know, the 5 things you need to know, the numbers of refugee crisis. And I find it quite remarkable and almost to the point of where it's painful for me, is that almost no one in Western media wants to talk about why this has happened in the first place. Go ahead.
That's exactly right, Peter. And I've written about this issue several times since then, because it seems to me that the entire discourse pertaining to the refugees and to the refugee crisis is situated within the entirely wrong parameters of debate here. Even progressive media, even newspapers in Britain like The Guardian, for example, are still dealing with the wrong question. This is not a humanitarian issue in the sense that Europe was completely oblivious to it and completely innocent of any wrongdoing. To the contrary, this is very much a political issue. And this is where I think the question should be centered in the first place. If it were not for the Western interventionism in the Middle East, starting with the Iraq War, followed by Libya and Yemen and Syria and elsewhere, we are not going to be finding ourselves in this situation debating this question in the first place. So this is not about assigning blame. It's about really trying to position the question back where it should be. It's a political issue and with humanitarian consequences, and should be discussed as such.
Okay, John, if I go to you in Paris, I mean, again, the discourse, the whole narrative about this is how to solve this problem, but it's not ever about who is responsible for this in the first place. I mean, if you look at all of the millions of refugees, and the poorest of the poor are still dislocated in Middle Eastern countries, they could follow under certain circumstances, but no one wants to look at the wider parameters of who is responsible for this. Most of these people don't want to be refugees. Who in their right mind wants to be a refugee? They've had to leave their places of where they live, their abode, for a reason, and it's not being talked about. Someone has to take responsibility for that, and I don't see anyone doing it.
Well, absolutely. I mean, the responsibility is very clear, isn't it? It lies with Britain and France for having attacked Libya in 2011, and it lies with the United States for having undertaken this regime change, so far failed regime change operation in Syria. America, Britain, and some European states continue to say that the solution in Syria is to overthrow Assad. David Cameron said it in the House of Commons the other day. All these things, obviously, are what we are now getting blowback from. Libya has been turned into a anarchic non-state, and Syria, obviously, into a war zone from which lots of people are fleeing. I'd like to make 2 points in addition to the point you've made, Peter, in your question, and the point that Ramzy made just now in his answer. Yes, the West bears responsibility for its wars. That's absolutely certain. Let's not forget that Turkey has a responsibility in this. Turkey, together with Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states, are, of course, financing the Islamic State in Syria. And Turkey is playing a very ugly double game because as we know, the refugees who are coming through Central Europe, through the Balkans and then Central Europe, and who've ended up in Germany, those refugees who we've essentially been talking about in the recent days and weeks, they have come through Turkey. So Turkey is fulfilling the same role in this, even though it's a functioning state, as Libya is. And that issue needs to be addressed. The other point I want to make very firmly is that, of course, A lot of these migrants are migrants and not refugees. I'm not talking about tub thumping here. The poor boy who drowned, Aylan Kurdi, had left Syria a year or two, I believe, beforehand. He had left with his family as an even younger boy than he was when he died. And he was going to the West for a dental operation. He was not a refugee by any stretch of the imagination. So, there are two separate issues going on here. Of course, a lot of the people who've been displaced into Turkey have been done so by war, but they're not strictly speaking refugees.
Okay, so, that's a very good point, John, and I'm glad you made it here. Saba, another thing that John said that, again, that needs to get more coverage and commentary is that some of the richest countries in the world per capita, the Gulf countries, want to wash their hands completely of this crisis, of the refugees and as John pointed out, migrants wanting to move someplace else. But they washed their hands completely of this. Again, not taking responsibility for their behavior. Go ahead.
Well, I think every country which is not helping should be criticized, whether they are the Gulf states or another. But I think we need to keep things in context. First of all, this is not a natural disaster.
A good point.
This is something which was intentionally made by the Western powers, who knew that if you start using force, people would run away. This is number one. Number two, I think if we begin to look at the issue in the context of one little boy or one little country, I think we will be doing exactly the same thing as the media is dealing with it. The situation now has to be addressed. What is being missing in the discussion, almost 90% of the refugees are not in Europe. 90% of the refugees are in Lebanon, in North Iraq, and in Jordan. And these countries cannot take any more people. If you look at the Gulf states, if you put the whole Gulf states, they will be smaller than one of the European countries. That's fine. They have the money. They should be making the contribution in that one. And I think the idea that somehow we begin to accuse Turkey, I think might as well accuse Greece and Hungary and all the countries where people pass through. That is not the issue. I think this is a diversion. I think those people, I know the Western media has the problem with ISIS. Those people, I assure you, the overwhelming majority are not running from ISIS. They are running from the war. The people who are in northern Iraq who are running away, they are being bombed every day, as well as being under the ISIS control. So they trying to divide the responsibility between which country allow them to pass and which terrorist organization is causing it. This is a diversion. The main issue is that these countries, that is the European countries, there used to be a term called the civilized world. The civilized world cannot allow human beings to die on their doorstep because they have no right to come in. This cannot be accepted from a humanitarian and legal point of view.
Ramsey, I think one of the things that I find most pathetic, to be honest with you, is reading the pages of the Washington Post. And their conclusion is it's not because of forced regime change, it's because it's not enough of forced regime change. And this is actually this tragedy, and I'm glad John Laughlin kind of spread it out here, because it is more complicated than the very emotional story. It is emotional, but there's a lot of facts and a lot of political calculation involved in this as well. And this is, it looks like a ploy for another move to overthrow the legitimate government of Syria. And if you don't have to like that government or not, it's legitimate, and forced regime change is illegal under international law, and we see some of the consequences now. Go ahead, Ramsey.
Which is the same attitude that's emanating from the UK in particular. David Cameron, who has accepted so far and resettled a total of 216 people.
Wow.
Unlike Germany, for example, that resettled about 800,000 people. Yet David Cameron is still talking and trying to utilize the tragedy and use every opportunity at trying to actually achieve political ends and further military intervention in the region. The American attitude is no different. What I think is really interesting about the American attitude.
Go ahead, Ramsey, real quick, and then I'll go to Saba.
If you don't mind if I just finish this point. What I think is particularly interesting about the American attitude is that no, it really did not start in Libya. It was the Americans who really started the whole thing in Iraq. Now, here's the thing that what John said about migrants versus refugees. The vast majority of people coming to Europe through Greece and Macedonia and etc. are coming from Syria, coming from Iraq, coming from Afghanistan. Can someone tell me, please, what are the common denominator between refugees or so-called migrants coming from these three particular countries? No, they are refugees and they are running away because of political crises that have been inflicted upon their countries in recent years. The American attitude is interesting in the sense that they are completely removed from this debate. They are watching it from across the Atlantic as if they had absolutely nothing to do with it, while in my opinion, they were the most culpable force in all of this.
Okay, Saba, if I can go to... Saba wanted to jump in there. That's why I said in my introduction that Europe was partially responsible. The other part is Washington. I'm glad you connected the dots there. Saba, real quick, go ahead, jump in.
Well, the U.S. is still forcing the Europeans to act. When we have the dishonesty of David Cameron telling us that he can actually use the military, we have only 8 tornadoes, for crying out loud, in Cyprus. And he is telling the public here that he's going to use the 8 tornadoes to go over Syria and it's going to get rid of ISIS. Now, had anybody else said it, everybody will say this is, this is total dishonesty. But he is doing it because the Americans want the British and the French and the Europeans to actually say, oh, yes, we are coming with you. We're going to send drones. Listen to Hollande. He's going to send drones to find out the areas of ISIS. What is he looking for? Men on a bloody van? Or what is he looking for? A base? An airport? What is he looking for?
All right. Saba, I have to jump in here. Gentlemen, we're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on the refugee crisis facing Europe. Stay with RT. Okay, I'd like to go back to John in Paris. I think, John, my job here on CrossTalk is to be a cynic, okay, and to facilitate conversation. So my cynicism is the following when we look at this crisis here. It's a very real humanitarian crisis that has been unleashed by wars of choice chosen by the West, particularly the United States. But the timing of all this is quite remarkable, I have to say. Over the last 14 days, we have Russia sending significant military assets to Syria. And now it's Syria's fault that we have this refugee crisis, and it's Russia's fault because Assad is still in power where he should have been finished off years ago. You see where I'm going. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is just looking at connecting dots over the last, let's say, 20 days of media coverage of multiple stories that are interconnected. Go ahead, John.
Well, I mean, the American, particularly reaction to the news about deployment of Russian advisors and so on into Syria gives the lie to the American claim that it is trying to defeat the Islamic State.
Yep.
That's obviously what Russia is trying to do by upping the arms exports and logistical and advice and so on that is being sent to Damascus. There's only one way to defeat the Islamic State in Syria. It's with the Syrian army. And Russia has understood this ever since the crisis started. And if America is opposed to that, then we have to indeed ask, why is it that, that America is opposed to this? Surely surely America should be pleased that Russia is trying to help out in this situation.
Obviously.
Where I'm cynical...
Go ahead.
Where I'm cynical is on a completely different issue. I, of course, completely agree with you about the root cause of this problem. But I repeat what I said earlier. The pictures show, in spite of all the propaganda in the media about families and so on, children or whatever, the pictures show that the 90% of the people who've been moving through Central Europe into Germany are young men. These are not, this is not the profile of a refugee. In a refugee situation, whole families go on the move, with old people down to children. These are young men. They are economic migrants. What I think is incredibly cynical in this has nothing really to do with the geopolitics. It's to do with the immigration policy of the various European states. The reason why Germany and other countries, particularly Germany, have been so sensitive, if you like, to these emotive images and have reacted in the way that they have, is that they have an immigration policy. They want large numbers of migrants to come onto their territory. Other European states don't want that. Hungary, Slovakia, Poland and so on. They've said they don't want these migrants. And this shows that the issue of refugees and economic migrants and so on is being, as it were, instrumentalized because Germany wants to have more migrants, it wants immigration, because it has a terrible demographic crisis, and it wants to soften up public opinion in Germany to accept what otherwise would be difficult to accept.
Okay, Ramsey, do you want to react to that?
I'm not sure why John is constantly trying to question the demographics of the refugees and constantly trying to kind of rebrand them as migrants, even though his politics seems to be on the right track, but then he insists on these little divisions. Well, I'll tell you why they are mostly young people, John. Mostly young people because let's say you are living Yarmouk or Halab or somewhere else in Syria, you are venturing out all the way to Turkey, you are taking a boat to Greece and from there to Macedonia and Serbia and Slovakia and all the way to mainland Europe, sometimes landing in Sweden or the Netherlands or Germany. Simply and only a young person can withstand the harshness of that journey, although we know that tens of thousands of older people and handicapped people and children also try to join them. The idea is once you get there, you start the process of getting your refugee asylum and you bring your family in a more proper way so that they are spared the harshness of the journey. And you brought earlier the little boy who drowned in the sea, and you said that he was there for a dentist operation. I am somewhat familiar with the situation in Turkey, and I can tell you that they can conduct any dentist operation that they wish to do. It's quite a developed country in many ways. I don't think that there was a father who would risk the life of his entire family in order for him to fix his son's teeth. And I think this is really important that we
that's exactly what happened.
Insist on the right terminology. Because when you say refugees, you mean accountability. You are talking about the Geneva Convention in which all European countries, Schengen countries and otherwise, should be held accountable to.
Okay, John, do you want to react to that? Let John, because that was directed to John. John, go ahead, reply if you want to. Go ahead.
Well, there's no doubt that the boy was coming for a dental operation because his aunt in Canada said so, and that's why they got him out of Turkey. I don't know why they didn't decide to go to a Turkish dentist, but that was the decision that was taken. And it was, I mentioned it because it's symbolic of the way that this issue is far more complicated than a simple
But it's belittling, John, isn't it? I mean, isn't this
to which
belittling?
we should respond emotionally.
I mean, the fact that you have 160,000 refugees, John, 160,000 right now in Greece and Italy, right now trapped in refugee camps, and you belittle the entire issue to a dental operation. Isn't that belittling of the crisis?
I'm not belittling anything. I'm speaking the truth. That boy left Turkey to have his teeth fixed. And it's the reason I'm mentioning it is that we cannot take a blanket emotive approach to this movement of people and say that they are all refugees. They are not all refugees. Most of them are economic migrants, and they are being welcomed into Germany as migrants.
Okay,
Germany has a bad demography, and it wants these people to come in. Just as the Labour government in Britain encouraged mass immigration into Britain for its own electoral reasons. You know, Peter talked about cynicism. We know that this happened in Britain. The same thing is now happening in Germany. That's why these people are being welcomed in. The Germans want people to pay their pensions.
Okay, Saba, jump in. Go ahead, jump in.
Yeah, I would like to really ask John to think about it. Is he really telling us that Germany is looking for refugees who are from Syria and from Iraq, who are mostly illiterate, who don't speak the language, they are uneducated, they don't have skills? Is this what Germany is looking for? And 800,000 people of that? Those people are a liability by any standard if one looks at it from an economic point of view. I understand Britain has the policy of immigration, bringing in people. You have the point system in Australia and Canada and what have you, and you need people who have with degrees and universities and small family and all the other requirements. Are you really trying to tell us that Germany is taking all those people because they want more people? Is this really the theory?
Well,
because I don't believe it.
Well, that's fine. You're at liberty not to believe it. But the fact is that Britain, I don't know what you're talking about, Britain doesn't have a points policy. Britain itself has had 600,000 migrants a year for the last 5 or 10 years. All these countries are bringing in cheap labour
No,
in order to drive down salaries
sorry, John.
in their own country.
John, sorry, you
and
are
in order
playing.
to undercut
John,
their own
sorry, you are
social
playing
state.
with the figures.
You know,
the figures. You are playing with the figures. The 600,000 are
I'm
not
not playing with
refugees. We're getting Europeans who are entitled to come here.
I said 600,000 migrants. I'm talking about migration. I'm precisely establishing the distinction between migration policy and refugee policy.
Exactly,
so
John.
Yes, but those people have a right to
this
come
is
to
where the
Britain.
disagreement, John.
All right, gentlemen, now let's go to Ramsey in Seattle. Jump in.
This is where the disagreement, I think the entire idea of positioning this debate within migrants, I'm not here to talk about migrant policies. Every country has the right to bring in whatever number of migrants they find suitable for the economic progress of that country. We are talking here about a refugee crisis. And again, if you position the refugee crisis within the proper political discourse, then we are discussing politics, we are discussing human rights, we are discussing humanitarian laws, we are discussing the Geneva Convention, especially the treaties that were signed after World War II. And we saw what happened to Europe with the massive dislocations of entire communities in Europe. The Syrian people, the Iraqi people, the refugees who made their way to Europe and are trying to get to Europe are entitled to the same rights that are enshrined in international law. Talking about some migration issues is of no concern to me, and I don't think it's of concern to this discussion, to be honest.
Okay, Saba, we're rapidly running out of time here. I want to ask all three of you here. I'm looking at really the decision makers here and the people that follow, and that means Washington and the people that follow Washington in Europe. There's the real possibility now that the neocons, under the last few months of Obama's administration, will take a final push and get rid of Assad here. Will we see a black flag over Damascus? Saba, and is that going to make the situation even worse? Saba, go ahead.
Not at all. Not in your lifetime or my lifetime. This is a threat which is being used. And I don't know those people who talk about ISIS really, what are they talking about? Because if a man doesn't carry the black flag, is he an ISIS man or not? What is an ISIS person? What are we talking about? I don't think those people who are killing children and women and I don't know what are rulers of any place. They can carry any flag, they can make any statements, but they cannot run states or people.
Okay, but Ramsey, if I can go to you, there would be a power vacuum. Who would fill it?
Absolutely. I don't think we even want to get to that point.
Yeah.
There has to be a political solution in Syria. There has to be a solution that is going to side with the Syrian people who are being victimized on a daily basis. There can be no political vacuum in Syria. And I think if the parties are indeed interested in a political solution, it can be found. One last thing I'd like to say, that there can be no military solution to the crisis in Syria. If firepower was of any value, a solution would have been achieved a long time ago. But clearly, this is not a solution at all, and we should not be thinking around these lines. Okay,
John Laughlin, 30 seconds. Go ahead. You got the last word.
I think, on the contrary, I think the only way to sort out Syria is for there to be a military solution. The politics can come later. And that military solution, which I would see as desirable, would be for the Syrian government to regain control of its territory. And whatever that takes is the goal that needs to be pursued. And until that happens, there won't be peace and there won't be an end to this humanitarian catastrophe.
Okay, on that point, gentlemen, we've run out of time. Many thanks to my guests in Seattle, London, and in Paris. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time. And remember, crosstalk rules. I love you.